It's fair to say that the Wimmera and its regional centre of Horsham is one of the state's worst served areas in terms of a passenger train. Currently, the Overland rambles through twice weekly at an average speed of 80 km per hour, stopping in Ararat, Stawell, Horsham, Dimboola and Nil. Alternatively, coaches transport passengers to the end of the current V-Line service at Ararat, where they can board trains to Melbourne. However, this wasn't always the case. 30 years ago, 3 return trains per day from Monday to Saturday and 2 on a Sunday run services past Ararat to Stawell, Murtoa, Horsham and Dimboola, 1 per day continuing to Adelaide. This continued until 1993 when all passenger trains past Ballarat were axed by Jeff Kennett. The Overland continued to run but has since become a day train run by a private operator with its frequency diminished from daily to twice weekly. In 1995, another major change to the rail line occurred. As part of the federal government's One Nation program, the previously broad gauge line from Melbourne to Adelaide was standardised, meaning the distance between the rails was moved closer together to suit the national standard. The route was also changed. Instead of running via Ballarat, the line now runs parallel to the Geelong line, turns off in Geelong and runs via Cressy, rejoining the original alignment at Ararat. The original and most direct route to Adelaide now consists of Melbourne to Ballarat and Ararat as broad gauge and Ararat to Adelaide as standard gauge, meaning it is impossible to complete an entire journey on the original route without changing trains, with all trains running to Adelaide routed via Geelong and Cressy. In 2004, the first step to improved public transport in the region was made, with the reintroduction of passenger trains to Ararat. I think the line is well overdue to be extended once again, this time to Horsham. It's the most realistic and easiest train to return in Victoria, and here's why. And just a quick disclaimer, yes, I know Horsham currently has a passenger train in the form of the Overland, but this video will focus on what a daily service operated by V-Line to better serve the Wimmera could look like. If you're interested in how we can improve the Overland service, there are several good videos which I will link in this one. So back to my reasoning. The first point may seem obvious to many, as it's the most crucial element to being able to run trains to different places, which is the track. While many other lines considered for reopening have had tracks slowly deteriorate or taken out completely, being on the main line to Adelaide, the track to Horsham is in very good condition, with continually welded rail and concrete sleepers. It runs over flat terrain and is mostly straight with minimal curves. The single track has 5 passing loops between Ararat and Horsham and is permitted for 115 km per hour running. However, the only thing stopping this track being permitted for 160 km per hour running is the lack of boom gates at every level crossing. The second is the area and people it would serve. Past Ballarat, the rail corridor currently serves 1,500 people in Beaufort and 9,000 in Ararat. With the addition of 6,000 in Stawell, 850 in Murtoa and 15,000 in Horsham, 20,000 including its local government area, this equates to approximately 37,350 people along the rail corridor. As the largest city in the Wimmera, Horsham also has road and bus connections to other regional towns such as Warwicknabil and Hopetoun, as well as Dimboola, Nil and into South Australia and Adelaide. This means the catchment area for the train would be much larger than just the communities it runs through. Several buses from these areas already run through and from Horsham onto connecting trains at Ararat or Ballarat. With a new train to Horsham, these coach journeys could be shortened, with passengers able to connect to trains at various stops along the line. On current coach lines that run past Ararat and out of Stawell and Horsham, there is a combined population of approximately 21,500 people within the state and more across the border. Currently there are 6 coaches per weekday to Horsham and 7 per weekday from Horsham. In a week alone, 108 coach services stop at Horsham, but only 4 trains pull into the station. Now, a standard coach will sit around 50 people. A 3-car unit of a Velocity train will seat more than 4 times that at 222 seats, and a set of 4 N-type carriages will seat 295. This leads me on to my third point, which is rolling stock. The line to Horsham is standard gauge, so would obviously need standard gauge rolling stock to operate on it, preferably with long distance facilities such as catering on board. Recently on the Albury line in northeastern Victoria, standard gauge locomotive hauled services have been phased out and replaced with new standard gauge velocities. These are modern trains built in Victoria by Bombardier, with facilities such as a cafe and charging points at each seat. Unlike the majority of V-Line's fleet, they operate on standard gauge, so would be able to run to Horsham, comfortably reaching the current line speed of 115 km per hour and able to travel up to 160 km per hour. They are the newest trains in V-Line's fleet and would be very easy to produce more of. Of course, as there is for everything, there are some obstacles to returning the service, the main being the gauge differences at Ararat. As mentioned previously, a train must run via Geelong instead of the more direct Ballarat route to travel to Horsham. Obviously, the Ballarat route would be the preferred corridor, as it's more direct and has a faster speed limit at 160 km per hour. Melbourne to Ararat via Geelong is 270 km. On the Overland, this takes 3 hours and 28 minutes. And Melbourne to Ararat via Ballarat is 205 km and takes only 2.5 hours. Now, there are a few different options for how services to Horsham can operate. The first is to convert the line through Ballarat to standard gauge. The second is to run trains on standard gauge all the way to Horsham via Geelong and Cressy. The third is a shuttle service from Ararat to Horsham. The fourth is a hybrid of both through and shuttle trains. And the fifth is the use of variable gauge trains. Let's investigate the pros and cons of each version. Converting the line through Ballarat to standard gauge would fix the indirect route, but would also be an inconvenience. The busy line to Ballarat would be shut down for construction, and many trains would need to be converted to standard gauge to use it. Other than to make passenger trains more direct, it would really serve no other purpose. Any freight from past Ararat has no need to run via Ballarat. It's easier to separate freight trains from the Ballarat passenger line and instead run them via Geelong, where grades are less steep and several freight facilities, including a port, are located. Although this might be an option for the long term, I can't see it happening in the near future. Running on standard gauge all the way would be the easiest way to return to service. The track infrastructure is already set up and used by the Overland service. However, as mentioned previously, it has a lower track speed and follows a less direct corridor via Geelong. The third option is a shuttle service, where a broad gauge velocity would run to Ararat and passengers would change to standard gauge trains to Horsham. The layout of Ararat station would work quite well for this. It currently has a broad gauge dock platform and a through standard gauge platform, allowing for a cross-platform interchange. It will allow the direct Ballarat route to be achieved at a cheaper cost, but would also have some disadvantages. Changing trains is always an inconvenience, and different facilities available on one part of a journey may not be on the other, creating inconsistencies in the service. If one train arrives late at the interchange point, it could also cause flow-on effects for connecting services, causing delays. However, Horsham customers are already used to changing to a bus at Ararat, so even a 10-metre walk across the platform to a connecting train would be an improvement. Timetabling could also be scheduled so that one train would always be waiting for an interchange with ample time before the other is scheduled to arrive. A hybrid option would make the best of both worlds, by giving passengers the option to change or stay on the train. It would also be a good indicator as to what customers would rather do, change trains for a quicker journey or stay on for a longer one. However, it would cost more to run two services. The risk here is, if you don't give passengers an option for an interchange, they complain it's not there, and if you do, there is a risk that barely anyone will use the slower service. The last option is the use of variable gauge trains. This is a technology that allows trains to run on multiple different track gauges. Special gauge changing bogies and stations need to be set up to allow for this. Most of these systems work by moving a train through one of these stations, where weight is removed off the wheels, wheel sets are unlocked and the track moves them into their new gauge. The wheel set is then locked and the weight is put back on the wheels. The train can then continue on its new gauge. These types of systems have been used since 1969, when the Spanish company Talgo implemented its gauge-changing system on the Barcelona-Geneva route. They are now used all around the world in countries such as Spain, Poland, Japan, and Switzerland. A train can only go 15 km per hour when it is changing gauge, but if this idea was implemented, it would take place near the station at Ararat, having little to no effect on journey time. This option would require a fair bit of effort, with new infrastructure needed to be set up at Ararat and new trains with gauge convertible bogies constructed, but would allow passengers to travel on the broad gauge to Ararat and continue on the standard gauge to Horsham without changing trains, seeing faster and more convenient journeys to Horsham and on to Adelaide. So what option do you think is the best for the short term and the long term? Let me know in the comments. Another thing to consider is when trains would operate. Currently on the Ararat line, there are 5 return trains Monday to Friday and 3 on weekends. Only one train is allowed to operate on the line between Wendouree and Ararat. Ararat also has stabling facilities that allow trains to be stored there overnight. The old Dimboola timetable saw trains leave Melbourne from Monday to Saturday in the morning and early evening, as well as the Overland service, which left Melbourne at 9 p.m. daily. Towards Melbourne, the Overland departed in the early hours of the morning, and then a morning and afternoon train each day. On Sunday, the Overland ran as normal, but only the morning train to Dimboola and evening train to Melbourne ran. An ideal frequency for a modern-day service would see 3 return trains each weekday and 2 on weekends, with trains departing each terminus in the morning, midday, and afternoon to evening each day. So how long would a service take? Before the Dimboola service was cut, travel time to Horsham averaged around 4 to 4.5 hours, and to Ararat around 3 hours. Currently, a train to Ararat will take around 2 hours and 20 minutes. Let's assume for this example that a train runs via Ballarat and switches gauges in some form at Ararat. When it gets there, it has a further 117 km of track to run on to Horsham. Going at the current line speed of 115 km per hour, it should take around an hour, but will add an extra 10 minutes for stopping and slowing. At this speed, it should take 3.5 hours from Melbourne to Horsham. Going at 130 km per hour would take 54 minutes from Ararat to Horsham. Adding on an extra 10, this totals to 3 hours and 24 minutes. Although these are only approximations, both are great for competing with existing public transport and driving, which takes around 3.5 hours non-stop. Now, this is the part of the video where I would like to say this is definitely what should happen. However, when researching for this video, I came to the conclusion that many people have strong and conflicting opinions on how they believe this service should be delivered. These all would work, but it's simply too difficult for me to determine the best possible outcome without conducting extensive research. I did come up with a rough concept, however. Whether you agree with it or not is up to you. The resumption of passenger trains running on existing infrastructure to Horsham, including stations at Stawell, Motoa and Horsham. One standard gauge velocity would run a shuttle service to Ararat, where passengers would change to connecting broad gauge trains to Melbourne. This would operate 3 times daily on weekdays and 2 times on the weekend, with departures each morning, midday and evening. The standard gauge unit would be stored at Horsham overnight, and so a stabling facility would need to be constructed. New freight passing roads would be needed at Ararat and Horsham, as well as platform upgrades at each station. Reworking of freight and passenger timetables to create the best paths and connections at Ararat would be required, and preferably timetabling would include skipping the more suburban commuter stops on the Ballarat line, then stopping all stations after Ballarat. The service would run on existing track, although a possibility to upgrading the line from Ararat to Horsham to 130 km per hour should be investigated. This would be the short-term option, while an investigation into the use of variable gauge trains is done. This would require more standard gauge trains with gauge convertible wheel sets and a facility to change gauges at Ararat. A company such as Talgo could provide gauge changing facilities, and Bombardier, who currently constructs V-Line's Velocities, could construct trains compatible with this system. These two companies have worked together in the past, so hopefully this could be achieved. That's all from me today. Let me know how you would like to see this service operate, and thanks for your time.